Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Ordinance Committee on, what is this today? Is the 11th, on October 11th, 2016. Madam Clerk, would you please read the roll call?
Councilmember Rouse?
Here.
Councilmember Hotchkiss?
Here.
Councilmember Murillo?
Here.
All right, very good. And at this point in time, we'll go to public comment, which is 2 minutes of comment on any subject not on the agenda. If there's any public that's here to speak? No speaker slips. Okay, thank you very much. We'll go to item 1. Madam Clerk.
2016 California Building Standards Code Adoption.
Good afternoon, Ordinance Committee members. I'm Andrew Stuffler, Chief Building Official for the city. And it's a pleasure bringing you our code adoptions and amendments for the 2016 California Building Standards. I'd like to start off with commending you if you were able to understand what we're proposing, given that you receive only a paragraph out of thousands of pages of code and what we're changing in that paragraph, and have to try to somehow figure out what we're trying to do with that. So today I'll answer whatever questions you have about our existing amendments, and as well as the new ones that we're proposing or that we've revised. But this is usually it's not something people get when they just read the ordinance. You really have to know the code and how these amendments fit into the code, and I'll try and help explain that to you if you have questions. I'd like to just give some background. You may be aware of this, but I'd like the community to understand how the codes work in our state and in the city. The state publishes, under Title 24 Code of Regulations, they publish the building standards. That's the building, plumbing, mechanical, electrical, fire, green building, energy codes. So there's this whole cadre of codes that they adopt. What I bring to you are the adoptions of parts 1 through 8 and 10 through 12, which is everything but the fire code. And then Joe will bring you the adopting ordinance for the fire code. We do that separately, specifically, and at the advice of the city attorney. The codes that the state adopts are national codes. International Code Council, which used to be ICBO, was kind of a common phrase, a term that we used to hear for code development. It's ICC now. National Fire Protection Association also writes some of the national standards that are adopted by the state. And the International Association of Plumbing and Mechanical Officials write the plumbing and mechanical codes that are adopted in California. They're adopted on a 3-year cycle, and they use an open public hearing process. They involve all the state agencies, professional organizations, local fire and building officials, and the general public. And it's facilitated by the State Building Standards Commission. Once they publish the codes, then they have 180 days for the codes to go into effect. Most of the time that's on January 1st of a year. So in this case, it's January 1st of 2017 that the state building standards codes will go into effect. We don't need to do any adoption. They're mandatory codes. As the state publishes them, we must enforce them. However, cities and counties can amend those codes based on 3 criteria or an administrative process criteria. So those would be climatic, based on the climate, the topography, the geology. Those are the 3 technical based findings we have to make to change a building standard, state building standard, or administratively if it has to do with our permit process, what we think is appropriate for us to take in the way of plans, engineering calculations, things like that. Got ahead of myself. These are the criteria that we can amend those. And in general, the amendments have to be more restrictive than the state. There is an exception to that in the state housing law, but that's the exception to the rule. As a rule, cities and counties can amend the codes and make them more restrictive if necessary. The process that we're starting with Ordinance Committee is going to lead up to 2 City Council actions, a first reading and then a second reading and adoption. So you'll see us again at least twice in front of the City Council. We did some additional outreach. We had the benefit of getting some input and feedback from the Contractors Association and from the Santa Barbara American Institute of Architects chapter, which was helpful, as well as other members of the public and prior building officials. We published. We have to publish a summary of amendments that we give to the state, and this is a pretty helpful document, I think, for a lot of people to understand what's in all those pages of code amendments. Down at if you look at find this document in your staff report today, there's a code and section number, which will tell you which code and which section's being changed, the subject of that change, and then a layman's terms kind of description of the concept, why we're changing it, and whether the amendment or change is new, existing, or revised. I'm going to spend most of my time on the new amendments that we're proposing, but I'll answer any questions you have on existing ones as well. And the last column just gives the State Building Standards Commission the basis for which we made that change: climatic, geological, topographical, or administrative. There are four, I think, kind of really beneficial amendments that we're proposing that are new. The first one being requiring a state licensed architect. At first, we thought that was appropriate for both residential 1- and 2-family homes as well as commercial and multifamily homes or buildings. But I think now that we've looked at the permit data more closely, we don't believe that's necessary for the residential 1- and 2-family home properties. I think we're good there. But on the commercial properties, when we trip a threshold of 20% in valuation, of improved valuation, then we end up getting into accessibility and some other more complex aspects of the design and plan check process, and we think an architect would be prudent there. It's not mandatory. It's just it would be a way for us to make clearly, transparently tell the public this is what we think is appropriate.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Just to illustrate or to amplify on that, although it's an extra expense for whoever is doing the project, the point is that without this additional expertise, it's probably going to be slowed down because you're going to have to go back and forth and sort of educate whoever's doing it if they're not a professional. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, you're correct.
Okay.
Additional rounds of plan
public
check.
to understand why we're making this suggestion, which is only a suggestion, but it's in fact to speed up the process.
Thank you for the clarification. Yes, it is. It's to try to help make the plan check process more predictable and more expeditious.
Great, thank you.
The same for the second bulleted item here, honoring a certified access specialist. There's a state law that gives a lot of benefits, non-building permit benefits, to businesses that have a report prepared by a certified access specialist about ADA compliance and accessibility compliance at the state level. What we don't want to have happen, and what we're starting to see happen, are differences of opinion between our CASP professionals and a private CASP professional. So we're proposing that if someone gives us a report that's filed with the state from a CASP, a certified access specialist, we'll honor that report and the findings of that report. And if that CASP signs the plan saying they comply, we're not going to debate on the details of it. That's a CASP certified professional that made that decision. We'll look at the assumptions associated with that, but we're not going to get into the details on that.
So we're taking contention out of the whole process here.
That's the
Okay.
goal.
All right, great, thank you.
Do you want questions as we go along? That's okay?
However, the chair would like that to work.
Well, how often does it happen that the city's specialist disagrees with the applicants? Does it happen all the time? Or?
I believe that
Rarely?
it probably doesn't happen all the time, but when it happens, it seems to be quite an event because it's usually towards the very end of plan check and everybody's tolerance for time is kind of diminished and they want their permit, and we're down to discussing truncated domes or something that is just frustrating and up for debate because it's not very clear in the code. And that's why we'd like to be able to just honor this certified access specialist that worked for the business owner or the property owner and honor their findings and just put our trust in that after checking the assumptions.
Thank you, Mr. Stuffler.
You'll see also the third bulleted item that we are trying to make it more clear about how metal panel roofing should be installed on buildings. We had a couple of fires, and Joe will tell you about this in his amendments. And fire events where we had wood shakes underneath metal panel roofing, and it made it very difficult for the firefighters to put the fire out, and so they had additional damage to the buildings that could have been prevented. We believe that there are national listings for the metal panel products that actually say you're not supposed to do this, but it's People get used to doing things. They don't look at the information. We thought we'd make it a little more clear, a little more transparent. That would help. But Joe can give more details on that in the fire code adoption. And then lastly, you may have heard the state published an on-site waste treatment system, OUTS, they called it, regulation back in 2012. And that changed the permitting of septic systems, both who could do the permitting and how they did the permitting of septic systems. Consequently, the city doesn't have the technical expertise to do that, and we have to send our constituents up to San Luis Obispo Regional Water Quality Control Office to have their septic system plans checked and get their permits from them. What we're proposing is to recognize the Santa Barbara County Environmental Health Office as the health authority, and that's a term used in the plumbing code, so that we can have our constituents get benefit of going to county health and get their septic system permits from the county health authority, county health office. The county health also has a special program they've arranged with the state called a LAMP program, and that allows our constituents to have a little more flexibility in their design of their septic system that the state won't offer them right off the bat. The state has to go through a lot of extra measures to approve something that's not a standard system. So we think this would be a very expeditious way to help our members of our community who utilize on-site waste treatment systems or septic systems and maintain them and get them permitted and keep them in good running order.
Mr. Stoffler, are there still septic systems being permitted within the city of Santa Barbara?
There are, not many, but there are in the peripheral areas, and there are some pockets in the city. I can provide that information for you outside of this meeting. I didn't bring the graphic with me.
Well, I mean, that's why it was kind of hard to imagine in this day and age, especially given the scope of our septic our sewer system. So there must be some threshold by which you can say it would be too onerous to connect to the sewer system to opt into a septic. I don't need to have all that right now. I'm just kind of surprised that it's even a subject at this point in time.
There are some geological barriers when we get into the hillsides that make it very difficult and expensive to progress sewer. And there are parts of town that historically haven't had sewer, and they don't have access to the sewer right now. Not in here, not in the main downtown area, but in other parts of the city. So,
thank you.
So I've just put the recommendation here, but I'm willing to answer any questions you have about the ordinance or any of the code requirements. Oh, I would like to draw your attention to a handout that was provided to you by Nicole, recommended edits to the proposed ordinance. And there are copies on the back and up here at the front of the dais, or the front of the staff table. We're proposing, these were changes I wanted to have made before we published it, but we didn't get them in on time. The grading ordinance, we're proposing to, on J109.1, add a sentence at the end of it. This is from our Creeks division. They would like us to be really, really clear about the fact that when you do grading, it has to comply with our stormwater national pollution elimination system permit requirements. So that's the last sentence being added, an underlined part of J109.1.
Is that more stringent than what we now require?
No, it is what we now require, but it's not explicitly written in the grading ordinance. So people come in, they think they're complying with the grading ordinance, and then they get to Creeks review, and Creeks says, show me your stormwater measures, and that people are surprised because that wasn't explicit for them. So it's a clarification to try to coordinate our regulations. The J109.2, the second change that's on there, that was proposed by our city attorney's office to make that more clear, and I agree it definitely makes that sentence more clear. I think that sentence must have gone through some revisions at some point and just wasn't very clean when it got finished. J110.1 is the same, very similar to the J109.1. That's where our Creeks division would like us just to be really explicit that compliance with our stormwater permit requirements is necessary. And then the last item, the residential code, this is I spoke to earlier. We after additional research, we believe that the 1 and 2 family residential code, we should not be requiring a licensed architect on that. We don't think that there's the same benefit as there is for commercial projects and larger residential.
Thank you. Ms. Murillo.
Thanks, Mr. Stoffler. So I heard required on the licensed architect, and then also that it was a suggestion. So you're saying it's required for commercial projects?
So what we're saying is it will not be required for 1- and 2-family home projects. All the other projects, it would be required whenever they did a new building or they did a building that had a valuation of construction. They made improvements to a building, and the value of those improvements were more than 20% of the value of the building.
Okay, got that. I did read your report. I have to confess to not reading all the codes. Maybe I will when it comes back to City Council. But I've been on the ad hoc committee for the new zoning ordinance, the updating our zoning ordinance, and there's been members of the public. There's a fellow out in the audience now, maybe he's going to speak about wanting to make sure that these codes allow for innovative construction in terms of sustainability, materials, energy saving, capturing light, so water conservation, landscaping kind of thing. And they've made an impressive presentation at the ENZO meetings, and the matter has been referred to the City Council's ad hoc. No, it's not ad hoc. It's our standing sustainability committee. And we're on that, Mr. Rouse and I. So I would like to hear from members of the audience. I see it seems like there's some building professionals here. So I read, but I'm curious to hear. I haven't been lobbied at all on this except for Mr. Ludwig, who wants to, if codes are preventing people from redeveloping properties so that we can address climate change, or now that we're in a drought, who knows, and the two are related, right? How can we accommodate creative, innovative building and stay within the honoring public safety and what your job is? So I do know that there's been some reference to the California Historical Building Code, that there might be some changes there. And I'm just looking forward to what the audience members have to say. But I would like, for us to take that into consideration. If we can be, this is Santa Barbara, and if we want to get ahead of making sure new buildings are sustainable, then how do we do that? So, thank you.
Okay, well, if there's no further questions from the committee, we'll go to public comment. I have some speaker slips here. There'll be 2 minutes at the podium for each speaker. The first speaker will be Roy Harthorne.
Roy Harthorne, building code consultant and former city building official from 1988 through 1996. I've been asked to assist some of the professional and business associations with the review of this ordinance, so it's possible I might go a little over 2 minutes. But first off, just commenting on a couple of things that Andrew covered. Under licensed architects, one area of unlicensed professional that is a regular that you're going to see regardless is kitchen designers. They don't have a professional license, and most all architects are going to use them. Kitchen designers, commercial kitchen designers.
Okay.
Yes. So they ought to take that into consideration, and it's a suggestion anyway. I think the building official can waive architect and engineer requirements, and I hope they will continue to do so. On the CASP issue, as the language is written, I would say fine, expediting a project is great. However, some of the comments about honoring what a CASP consultant as the end decision is a dangerous consideration, because that's essentially delegating the police power to a private professional. And while these people have taken a test, they are just like an architect or an engineer, and building departments regularly have difference of opinions with architects and engineers. So the city needs to retain absolute control as to what the final decision is relative to a disabled access regulation. I did consulting work for the DOJ's office, and I'm sure that they would be unhappy to hear that accepting a CASP certification carte blanche would be inappropriate.
Mr. Hawthorne, if I may,
Yes.
how many more points do you have? Because you are over your 2 minutes already. So
Well, I've got one more.
we'll go with one more then. Thank you.
That again is referring to Mr. Stuffler's items, and it was particular to a comment of yours relative to septic systems. I just checked, and it's still on the books. The definition of an available sewer is any sewer that cost less than $1,000 to construct. If it's more than $1,000, it's not an available sewer. And this exception was written back in 1954, hence that archaic definition in monetary value. And as such, it needs to be taken out and updated.
Very good. Well, thank you.
Lastly, I'm going to hand you.
Okay, Mr. Hotchkiss, I believe, has a
I got a
question.
question for you. When you say updated, you want the price increased?
Or just eliminate it, because the plumbing code already has a definition for available sewer. And frankly, having one in the municipal code is redundant and unnecessary.
You know what the definition is?
Yes, it's within 200 feet, 500 feet. I don't remember exactly the number of feet. But Kevin Goodwin up on the Riviera just recently built a brand new sewer system in the Riviera, simply because it cost more than $1,000. Okay,
right.
I know I've exceeded my time.
I need to move on to the next speaker.
I'm going to leave you with a set of proposed changes to the ordinance, and in particular, the fire sprinkler requirements for both.
Hey, thank you. I don't want to go further because we are way over time.
Right.
So
Well, the other folks that are going to follow me
Great,
are going
they'll
to
get a
speak to
chance to
these
do it.
items.
Thank you, Mr.
And lastly, there are other organizations that would like to be here, but there was not enough notice provided.
All right, very good.
Including the Chamber and the Downtown Organization and the Milpas Association.
Okay, Mr. Campanelli, please.
Good afternoon. You guys don't have an easy job, obviously, and we're dealing with code, the NZO, and the code adoption every 3 years where they're reviewed. And staff in the fire department don't have an easy job. So I want to preface this comment to you by having been in the trades for 40 years, sitting on the Contractor Association board and currently sitting on the AIA's board. My observations are that we try to do a good job of building safe buildings and meeting codes and compliance. And there's this ongoing problem where the general public sometimes, you wonder what's their attitude about the building department, about zoning, and about public works, and about city council, and about how you, as our stewards for the city, operate. And when we're dealing with issues like these codes, fire sprinkler upgrades, the code increase in the NZO, you have to ask yourself this question. Is the general public's response that it's like, wow, this doesn't sound like community building, this sounds like government building? And sometimes it's good to just go back to our roots and say, why are we here in this room? Why are we doing these things? And the reason I say this is that when I have people that come and do things and they go, I'm not going through the city, I'm not going to do it with a permit because it's just going to take me 6 more months, it's going to cost me $20,000 more. Those guys never listen, they aren't in our corner. Well, in my experience with the city, with the building department, that's not always the case. Sometimes they're extremely helpful. I spent time with the fire department yesterday trying to deal with fire sprinklers. And there's a disconnect in how we communicate these things to the public. And I think if you have to ask yourself, are we building community? Because if you have community support, they're more likely to say, you know what, I am going to call City Hall. I am going to go down to the building department. I am going to see if they can help me. There needs to be some training there. You have a lot of stuff to approve, so I'm not going to go any further with this.
Thank you.
Mr. Campanelli, can I ask you a question, please?
Mr. Hotchkiss?
What's your suggestion? There needs to be some training, you said?
I think that there should be a training where there's this kind of dialogue about why are we here, what's our job. I mean, obviously, you've got a code book that's that thick, and you have to enforce that code book. But when you only read code book, you sound like a code book. You don't sound like you're not standing in your neighbor's shoes.
Oh.
And that's important that there's a learning curve on the service side because our tax dollars pay for you guys to sit here.
So after this, maybe you could tell me a little bit about
Sure.
specifically about the training thing, but not right now.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah, just so we can remind everybody, we are talking about adopting building codes today as opposed to what we're doing at 630 Gardens.
Not adopting those codes.
Right. All right. Mr. Ludwig.
Thanks for the opportunity to address you guys today. First, I just want to say I appreciate the quality of thought behind all the proposed local modifications and all the hard work you guys do. And I really just have a question for Andrew. Is there still a window open for modifications to the local adoptions?
Mr. Chair, I don't mind answering that if you want me to.
Oh, go ahead. I'll stop the clock, but yeah, it's a little unusual. Go ahead.
So, we're at Ordinance Committee. We would have, if we made changes that were substantive, and Scott Vincent from the City Attorney's Office can confirm this, then we would have to come back to the Ordinance Committee for another hearing. If they're editorial changes, then we don't need to.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
So I'll be in touch. Perhaps we can meet together and discuss the possibility of bringing a proposal back to the Ordinance Committee. Thanks.
Thank you. And then the final speaker is Ellen Bilston.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this topic. Andrew Stuffler reached out to the AIA and the Contractors Association of Santa Barbara to be involved in the process, and I wanted to thank him for the opportunity to take a look at some of these documents together. One of the areas of concern is concerning the section 903.2, the additions to buildings other than single-family residences. Whereas the state sees that the addition of floor area to an existing building that contains any occupancy other than Group R, Division 3, has been struck out. I think we need to be really careful about making it so that sprinklers are going to be required for pretty much any project. I think this section of the ordinance needs to be really carefully looked at. There are other exceptions that are taken out from the state code that would apply then to the city. Basic maintenance issues like termite repair and replastering, storefronts and signs. I mean, fairly minor changes to buildings would potentially trigger the need for a complete fire sprinkler upgrade to the building. So I think these are things we have to be careful that we don't overreach in our desire to make all buildings safe with fire sprinklers. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Stuffler, that brings up a question. So, what are there set thresholds for those kinds of revisions? So, for example, on a minor, like a plaster upgrade or repair, what would trigger the re-sprinkling of an entire, for either a commercial or residential building? Or maybe the chief wants to.
Mr. Chair, I have the perfect person for that response.
I thought you might.
Joe Porre, City Fire Marshal, Chair and committee members. There are, and I'm in possession of a document submitted by, I think, Mr. Hawthorne regarding, the various exceptions that might be taken. As I look it over, and I'll address this in the fire code adoption, most of them exist. Their repairs and those types of things are not a part of the fire sprinkler ordinance. And that includes fire repair. If you have a fire in your home and it guts 2 or 3 rooms, we don't invoke the sprinkler ordinance to repair your house. If you have flood damage, mold, mildew, that kind of thing, we don't invoke the sprinkler ordinance to repair your house. That's simply repair. So repair is already built in.
All right. Mr. Hotchkiss?
So if I could, so the concerns that this lady just spoke of don't exist, really, is what you're saying? She's talking about wood,
In terms of repair,
termite damage and stuff?
Correct. That's correct. The thing about repair jobs is that if you come in with a repair permit, just say either an enforcement case or because of termite damage or flood damage, it cycles through the plan check process to the various divisions that need to look at something like that. And if it looks like a repair job, it's a repair job and it gets a pass. It doesn't, the sprinkler ordinance is not invoked. If it looks like something other than a repair, if it's called repair but it looks like more extensive than repair, then we might look at it, with a closer eye. But that's just a matter of discretion. But when it comes to repair, it just does not invoke the sprinkler ordinance and hasn't.
But once again, we've gone through a little bit of that in some of our fire zone houses have been rebuilt, whether it was new or it was repair, whether replacement. And are there, like as in ADA, are there dollar thresholds, or as one gentleman talked about with the septic tank, is there a threshold set that says, well, once you've gone to this percentage of the building and or dollar level, it's going to kick into that next level?
Not if it qualifies as repair. The T-fire is a good example. We had sprinklers that went in voluntarily after the T-fire, but the only thing that was invoked after the T-fire as a hard and fast rule was high fire construction requirements. In other words, you had to comply with current building codes in terms of the way your house was constructed. But if it's a repair job, if you've been a victim of a disaster or it's a repair for flood damage, that kind of thing, we just don't invoke it.
Very good. Mr. Vincent, would you prefer that we take these items separately in terms of voting to forward them to council?
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea.
Okay. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm really moved by what was said today, especially if it is our job to make sure that government is friendly to the public, especially members of this industry, part of our economy, part of our community. I would like us to have one more ordinance committee meeting if we can, so that you can notify people who would like to be here. Ms. Bilstein, I appreciate what you do. Get some of your architecture people in your sustainability work. And I'm projecting ahead a little bit. We have the amendments to the fire code submitted today. This wasn't part of the published administrative record report. And so the fire, you all haven't seen this yet. And so I think we need another, I'm projecting ahead to, the next presentation, but I'm just having a procedural issue that I think we need to have another ordinance committee meeting. And Ms. Grisanti, I'm not sure who would tell us right now how soon could we come back, please.
We would have to look at the calendar, but I would say within the next couple weeks.
Well, first of all, Ms. Grisanti, was this all noticed by a normal time frame, postings, our normal procedure, right?
It was.
Thank you.
Right, except that this document from the fire department wasn't part. It wasn't, right? It wasn't part.
I'm surprised to learn that, actually.
No, it was part of it.
I believe it was. We submitted it anyway.
I had the whole full fire thing.
It's not in my binder. I guess that's something for us to think about as the hearing goes on. Mr. Chair, if we would like to give the community a little more time.
We did, once again, this is the first reading with Ordinance Committee, and our decision today is whether or not to forward this to council for the full hearing.
My suggestion is that the Ordinance Committee needs another go at it.
Could I ask
and the community in particular.
Okay. We have to, in order to do a rescheduling, though, we have to make sure there's a substantive amount of change that we are wanting to address and not just a point or two, because that, once again, we're here to potentially forward this on to council. So,
Mr. Chair, may I ask
Mr. Stuffler.
Councilmember Murillo, what document can you show that to Nicole so we can see if I'm not sure what document you're speaking to. So
it's the Santa Barbara City Fire Department, their amendments to the code.
They're on the agenda. They're the next item.
They're on the agenda, but this document wasn't given to me, or they were.
It's published. It was on the website. It was.
Okay, maybe it just.
Here it is, right here.
Okay, maybe it didn't get into my binder.
Could
but,
be.
Okay.
May I make a suggestion, if
Mr.
Moreno,
Hodges?
that we do vote on this first thing and that we put it forward, but with the consideration that we take Mr. Hawthorne's suggestions and take a look at them and reevaluate them, and then when we go to City Council, we could present those. But meantime, all of this seems to me to be pretty good, and I'm very careful about overly restrictive stuff, and you and I have gone over this. I think we're okay here. I don't hear any red flags from the builders. Am I wrong?
Well, what we could do, Mr. let me suggest, is that staff has been here to receive the comments of the public, and they've been duly recorded, and that we can direct staff to respond to some of those public comments at the full council hearing. And I think that may be the way to go if that
I
works
agree
for
with
the
that.
rest of the committee.
I'm checking to see what was published online. And Ms. Grisanti, if you have the city's website too, I think it's important. If it was missing elsewhere, not just my binder, then we have a problem.
But you're talking about the fire department part, though. That's not
Right.
we're not even talking about that part yet.
Well, I would also like to continue the first section on the building codes. We heard from these gentlemen that they couldn't finish what they were saying in 2 minutes, and from what I heard is that members of your industry did not know about this meeting. There wasn't enough time to gather people to come and talk to us about your concerns. That's what I heard.
That is what you heard,
So
Ms.
I'll be
Brown.
voting no to forward
Okay,
the
well,
first
wait a
section
minute.
if that's
Wait a
where
minute.
we're headed.
Mr. Chair, may I offer some insight? We began meeting with the Contractors Association and the AIA, about a month ago. We've had 2 meetings with them prior to this meeting, and we've given them the tentative dates of this meeting and the subsequent City Council meetings for October 25th and November 8th. So that's been made available to the Contractors Association and the AIA. And then I personally checked last week. Whenever I have an item coming to council, I go online and I make sure that everything's there, that it all gets uploaded so that we're in compliance with the Brown Act and I don't have issues there. So we've done our best to make sure everything was posted and to communicate even more than we needed to a month ago about the dates. So I don't think we're going to be able to be more clear, but just so you know, that did happen.
Well, I'm satisfied with that, and I think that those meetings, sorry.
Okay, I
I would move that we pass this first, what we're calling it here.
item 1.
Yeah, item 1, with the considerations that you've cited and what the
Staff.
builders and others have said, and bring that back to council. Anyway, that's my motion.
Okay, I'll second that. Okay. All in favor? Aye.
No.
Okay.
Opposed.
Passes 2-1 to forward that to council. Once again, with staff taking into consideration comments from the public, and of course, you probably have some material from your previous meetings with the AAA and the Builders Association. So,
Will do. Thank you.
okay, let's go to item 2. Would you read that, please, Madam Clerk?
2016 Fire Code Adoption.
Good afternoon again. One of the good things about going second is I don't have to cover some of the ground that Andrew already covered. As he pointed out, the codes are all adopted under Title 24, and the fire code is a part of that. It's Part 9 of Title 24. The reason that one of the reasons that we set it aside is because a lot of the fire code is maintenance oriented and not building oriented. The California Building Standards Commission generally adopts all of these codes, but in the California Fire Code, it only adopts the sections that apply to building standards. It leaves out some critical sections for us, such as Chapter 3, which have to do with open burning, those kinds of things, simply because they don't apply to building standards. Likewise with the section on explosives, the section on wildland care and that type of thing, defensible space, those kinds of things. So as I go through this, I'll try to clear up a couple of points where they actually converge as well. Again, it's a 3-year cycle, and I won't spend too much time on this, but we're, again, Part 9 of the California Code of Regulations, Title 24, and we're adopted under Municipal Code 8.04. The building code is adopted under the 2000 section. That's what it looks like. There's a copy in the city clerk's office. And basically the way it works is the state adopts the International Fire Code. We get this no matter what, because this is now state law. So if we did nothing, we would end up with the California Fire Code. That code, and it's been referred to here already in this meeting, we are allowed to amend, but we can't make it less stringent. We can only make it more stringent. We have 180 days to adopt after the state adopts it, and it goes into effect on January 1 of 2017. So the fire code consists of both building standards adopted by the state and non-building standards that are adopted by us. Those are the maintenance standards that I was talking about earlier. We adopted this version of the code. We used to have the Uniform Fire Code as the base code for the state. We now adopt the international codes along with the building division, and we began that in 2010. If you recall, if we go back a little farther than that, 1 year before that, we adopted what we called the Sprinkler Ordinance. The Sprinkler Ordinance we had set aside because we wanted to vet it for about 9 months, separate and aside from the code, so that we would have plenty of public input and people would be able to come in, particularly the contractors and the architects, and have a say in how that was constructed. And we did. We got a lot of input. I think, as a matter of fact, at the time, Councilmember Francisco said it was probably the most vetted ordinance he had ever seen. So we spent 9 months doing that, and then we adopted it in September of 2009. That became part of the 2010 International Fire Code when we adopted the whole thing all over again, since it's on a 3-year cycle. In 2013, the state did a little change up on us. They took residential standards out of the building code and away from the fire code, and they put them in a new code called the residential code. So when we talk about the sprinkler ordinance, we have now split the sprinkler ordinance. We have residential sections for 1 and 2 family homes in the residential code, and we have split the commercial section off, and it remains in the building code. So they complicated our life a little bit, so that you don't necessarily see in the building code adopting ordinance those residential sections. That's the reason why. They fall under the R sections of the building code, the residential sections. I think it's R313 through R323, and they're in your packet. But that's strictly for 1 and 2 family homes. So back in 2010, I'm going all the way back, Council approved our modifications, and most of them remain in the ordinance to this day. We, particularly in this iteration of the code, we kind of resist the urge to tinker with it too much, so we haven't really adopted anything new. The matrix that you see basically explains sections that have been in the code since 2010, with a couple of minor examples, and I'll point those out. But in the California Fire Code, and this goes to that fire sprinkler section that we were talking about, 903.2.20, which deals with fire sprinklers. It's the one that we've had since 2009. Now, the 900 sections are identical in both the building code and the fire code. So if we make a change in one code, we have to make the identical change in the other code, because the 900 sections, all the fire protection systems, are exactly the same in both codes. So it is appropriate to talk about sprinklers in the building code and in the fire code simultaneously, because they do coexist in both codes. They're companion sections. This is the matrix that was up for question a few minutes ago. And again, I don't want to re-explain what Andrew was talking about, but it basically puts in plain language what the nature of any changes that we're making are. We have no real new sections. Language modifications were made to certain sections. I believe one of them has to do with the adoption of the sprinkler ordinance itself. The square footage requirements and when it triggers the ordinance. I believe the old language said from the date of the adoption of this code, and we realized this year that if we did that, then it would reset every 3 years. It would be from the date that we adopted it, for instance, in this case, January 1st, 2017, and the idea was to go forward from September 9th of 2009. So we changed that language, a minor wording change. And we changed a few things in non-building standards. For instance, in Chapter 3, there's a section that we used to have in the code that the state and the international code both removed, which had to do with noxious fumes coming from open burning. And in those particular cases, we wanted the flexibility to be able to enforce if somebody, for instance, had a bonfire going and the smoke was going directly in the window of somebody else's house. We didn't want to have to go out there as a fire department and say, call APCD. We wanted to be able to actually take some kind of enforcement action by saying you're going to have to quell the fire, for the health and safety of your neighbor. So we put that section back in the code.
You get many calls like that?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it's usually it has to do with literally smoking. People who have significant smoking operations in their yards where they smoke meat, the actual smokers literally do their job and they put up a lot of smoke. And then there are people who do have fire pits where they're burning inappropriate material or it's not burning cleanly or whatever. And yeah, we get a lot of calls like that. There was one other, and actually, if we could address a couple of the sprinkler issues, it would be a little beyond what I had planned to present, but it might at least illuminate a few things. As we were talking about before, the repair and that type of thing, and as I look through this list, most of these things already fall under the repair element of what we're allowed to do. Well, we do have latitude, and we exercise it all the time about what's allowed to repair. We don't make lists like this because if you're not very careful when you construct code language, you get in trouble for the things you leave off the list as much as the things you leave on it. And we don't. Since a lot of these things are redundant, they're all repair jobs. We don't construct lists like this because it just isn't accurate enough. Sorry? Oh, yes, I'm sorry. The document I'm referring to was submitted by Mr. Hawthorne. And incidentally, I'd like to thank Mr. Hawthorne and Mr. Campanelli and Mr. Ludwig and Ms. Bilstein for coming out and contributing to this process. A lot of times we go through code iterations and we don't get much input, and so it's nice to have input in the public hearings. But the document that I'm referring to is the 2016 building code proposals that Mr. Hawthorne submitted. And when you look at these, basically there are a couple of things that I'm not very clear on the language of, but in terms of the list of exceptions, most of those fall under repair already. And it's something that we are currently doing. We already do.
Some years ago, we spoke about residential remodeling, and I think boosted the threshold up to 75%. But I'm looking for, I don't see that language anywhere in here. Is it elsewhere? It's just in this, not in this new document?
That's exactly what I was trying to clear up because it doesn't fall into the fire code anymore. It's part of the residential code now.
Okay.
But it still exists. It's still 75%. That's correct.
You and Mr. Campanelli and I had a productive conversation years ago, and I'm glad that has gotten in there. Otherwise, it's 50% for things that are other than single-family residences?
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, we have, Ms. Rio, any questions? I don't. Okay, we have one public comment from Mr. Hawthorne.
Fortunately, all the unspoken to items are fire sprinkler oriented, so I've gotten my chance. One item on other than single family dwelling and duplexes that was supposedly dealt with 6 years ago, but evidently not, was the fact that any addition to a non-residential building triggers fire sprinklers. 1 square foot triggers fire sprinklers. This came up a couple years ago with Mario and Kay Castagnola moving back into their 3-unit apartment. They were adding 100 square feet to this 3-unit apartment building. It triggered fire sprinklers. We asked for code modification. Code modification was not granted. However, the fire sprinkler requirement was simply waived. I don't know how that exactly worked, but nevertheless, the Castagnolas got what they wanted. It's a problem. There needs to be some latitude for small additions for apartments and condominiums that don't otherwise have the same 75% addition threshold. So 1 square foot to a condominium project or an apartment building, it triggers fire sprinklers for the whole building. I've provided language that will address this item, and that's under my item number 1. Number 2, like the item number 4, is essentially a long list of repair and maintenance type items. But there are a couple of critical ones in there that clearly do not fall into what Mr. Poirier and his staff have been utilizing as references to exceptions, those being interior partitions and work that involves removing interior drywall. They simply consider that an alteration, and they include the whole area. So if you've got damaged drywall from rain damage, from mildew, and you want to replace it, you take it down, you're stripping the house, they consider that an alteration. They consider all the square footage. So that list is expansive because the public needs to be reassured that these things are all covered. These are normal repairs, but presently they're not being allowed. Also, on small changes of cafes with an occupant load of under 50 to something over that, California Fire Code allows up to 100 occupant load with no sprinklers required. The city deleted that section 6 years ago. So there are exceptions in the California Fire Code that were removed 6 years ago that need to be put back in. It's the chance for a small cafe that, is doing well. There's a space next door. They want to move in and add, another 20, 30 seats. At this point, it's cost prohibitive for them because now they have to sprinkler the whole building, possibly even their neighbors. So these are some important items which I think is worthy of another hearing of these ordinances, and also to include the downtown organization, the Chamber of Commerce, who are unaware of this. They weren't invited. They should be part. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, as to the committee. Ms. Murillo.
Is there a staff response to Mr. Hawthorne's comments?
There is actually. If a permit comes in for repair of drywall, for dry rot, for flood, for whatever, it doesn't invoke the sprinkler ordinance. And I'll just reemphasize that again. If someone comes in and simply tears the drywall off the inside of their house in an effort to remodel it, that's something else. And if they if it's for some other reason than repair, it does make a difference. If it's for remodeling purposes, it makes a difference. So that's, that wasn't a completely accurate statement. The other thing is that when you're talking about interior partitions, you're really talking about walls. So when you're building walls on the inside of a house, you're remodeling. It's an interior partition, other than a freestanding partition, which he does mention here also, is simply a wall. Freestanding partitions, we don't invoke the sprinkler ordinance for freestanding partitions, never have.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Yeah. So the comment, Mr. Arthur's comment that any addition of any amount triggers sprinklers, even 1 square foot. I'm not sure what we do about that. That does, if it's stated that way, that sounds extreme.
It sounds extreme, and first of all, let me correct another part of the record. He was looking at the commercial section, not the residential section.
Right. Well, how about for condos and apartment buildings?
And when he was talking about the Castagnola's place, he was talking about an addition and an expansion of what we call an R3, in other words, a single-family home, into a small apartment building with 3 or 4 residences in it. So it's it's comparing apples and oranges. But in the commercial section, we don't see additions of 1 square foot. But I'll give you an example of some things we do see. For instance, if one of our boards and commissions says that you need to enclose this mechanical device on the outside, let's say it's an HVAC unit that's sitting on the outside and it doesn't look good, and they want it enclosed by a wall and an open top, we will not invoke the sprinkler ordinance for something like that. That technically is an addition, but it's a common sense thing. If it's just enclosed as a screen to keep the public from seeing, this mechanical device, that's not something that would trigger the sprinkler ordinance either, and that would be substantially more than 1 square foot. But
he's just using that as an illustration.
Yes, but in my 35 years, I've never seen a 1 square foot addition to a commercial
I don't think he
building.
has either. But what we're saying is there does it make sense to have some sort of square footage trigger for condos or apartment buildings?
For condominiums and apartments, you could. It just depends on how it starts out. Because you'd have to craft an ordinance that, if you were taking a single-family home and turning it into 12 units, for example, you'd have to figure a way to draw the line.
I understand.
And as far as the commercial side of the thing goes, if you take away the addition section of the ordinance, it kind of goes against the general California trend of, ultimately in California, the state wants all the buildings sprinklered. The exception that he talked about in the California Fire Code does still exist. The California Fire Code also allows buildings up to 5,000 square feet to be non-sprinklered in certain cases. Again, this goes back to when we created this ordinance in 2009, taking the city prerogative of saying we can make the code more stringent than the state. That is more stringent than the state. Yes, we are.
Is a decision on sprinklers appealable if there's a difference of opinion?
Of course. Not only that, if someone appeals it to my staff, they'll come to me. For instance, I spent quite a bit of time with Mr. Campanelli the other day trying to sort through an issue that neither of us can quite figure out at this point. But as that goes on, if they don't get it through me, the appeals board that exists for the building division is the identical appeals board that we use. So they also have that route to go. And Mr. Hawthorne has taken advantage of that.
Okay. All right. I'm satisfied with these replies. I'd like to move this forward as written.
A question, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
So, Mr. Stuffler, what if we recommend this and the prior item to the City Council, what recourse do people have to continue to suggest changes? How would that work?
According to state law, an ordinance committee review is not required. That's a city requirement, and we honor that. But there's a specific process for making amendments to the state building standards. I kind of touched on them in one of my slides. So there's a first reading. It's usually done on consent. It's where we take our ordinances and we put them in front of City Council on the consent item agenda, and we say, here it is, public. And we're setting a date for, in this case, November 8th, to hear this item. So read it, understand it, and ask questions, because on November 8th, we're going to sit in front of City Council and recommend this gets adopted. And that's a period of time the state wants us to have to give to the public to make comments, to have it available. Mm-hmm. And they have a specific noticing requirement that is different than our other ordinances. It has to go, and I don't know if Nicole has the word on this, but I know Sarah does in our city clerk's office, but it goes through a specific noticing requirement and publication in a newspaper, so that it is even more broadly made aware that we're adopting and amending building standards. And we have to wait 2 weeks between the City Council meetings, so the public has that time to make those readings and those findings and confirm that that's what they want.
So one option, Mr. Stoffler, would be that this body could vote to not put it on the consent calendar, but to make it an administrative item on the City Council agenda, so that there could be more input. Is that right?
I would defer to Mr. Vincent on that.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, the way the state code is set up is that it anticipates a consent hearing, that the second reading of this particular style of ordinance, where you're adopting other ordinances by reference or other codes by reference, it flip-flops our normal procedures. Our normal procedures for other city ordinances, zoning ordinances are probably the ones you're most familiar with, have the first reading as the public hearing. And then the second reading is on consent. The ordinance title is read, but there's no second public hearing. As Mr. Stuffler has already explained, the state code flips that process. It still means that there is going to be the same amount of public hearing. It's just that the notice is front-loaded so that there is that period of time between the first reading of the title of the ordinance that informs the members of the public that we're adopting by ordinance other codes by reference. Then there's the period of time where the public can ruminate over those ordinances, over those code provisions, and then presumably they're more prepared for that public hearing that's held in the second hearing. It's a different process, but both methods are intended to achieve the same thing. That there is an opportunity for the public to be aware that the city is adopting by ordinance other codes by reference, and that there will be a public hearing on those codes.
Thank you. Thank you both for that. And I mean, I did hear that the downtown Santa Barbara and the Chamber of Commerce might want to weigh in on it, and it sounds like there would be an opportunity for that. And I did check the document that I was concerned about was published, and it was in my binder, just not what I brought up here. So I apologize for that.
Just a quick comment. I sit on both boards of the Chamber and the Downtown Organization, which the latter met this morning, and we did talk about the agenda and the items coming up today. So, you know,
And no representative was sent here, you're saying?
Well, there wasn't nobody at that meeting chose to, even though they represent all the different factions of our business community. So, but the bottom line is this was properly noticed. It was noticed and is in the offices of both of those organizations. So, we're not doing this in secret.
And wherever the item appears with City Council, we can always pull it if it's on consent.
That's correct.
So
we can always.
We have ultimate control.
Right.
Oh, anyway, I stand by my motion. I think it makes sense, but I look forward to hearing what you say.
Oh, I'll vote, sure, and we'll move it on and work with the stakeholders.
Okay, so moved by Hotchkiss, second by Murillo.
I didn't second it. I thought you did.
Okay. Would you like to second?
No, sir. I'd be
I
more
will second it
comfortable.
then. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.